A number of mitochondria provides a greater capacity to produce ATP aerobically. A high number of capillaries surrounding the muscle fiber ensures the fiber will receive adequate oxygen during periods of contractile activity. Myoglobin is similar to hemoglobin. Is similar to hemoglobin in the blood that it binds to O2 and also acts as a shuttle mechanism for O2 between the cell membrane, and the mitochondria. Therefore, a high myoglobin concentration improves the delivery of oxygen from the capillary to the mitochondria, where it can be used collectively. The significance of these biochemical characteristics is that muscle fiber with a high concentration of myoglobin, along with a high number of mitochondria and capillaries, will have a high aerobic capacity and therefore will be fatigue resistant during prolonged submaximal exercise. The second important biochemical characteristic of muscle fibers is that the different myosin isoforms differ in the myosin ATP phase activity. In humans, three major myosin isoforms exist, and these isoforms differ in their activities. Example: speed that they break down ATP, muscle fibers that contain ATP phase isoforms with high ATP activity will degrade ATP rapidly. This results in high speeds of muscle shortening. Conversely, muscle fibers will, with low ATP phase activities, shorten at slow speeds. Finally, the third important biochemical characteristic of muscle fibers that influence contractile proteins is the abundance of contractile proteins, example, actin and myosin in the muscle fiber. Indeed, large fibers that contain large amounts of actin and myosin generate force that more force than fibers with low levels of these key contractile proteins. More details about fiber differences in the level of actin and myosin will be discussed later in the chapter. Contractile properties of skeletal muscle. In comparing contractile properties of muscle fiber types, for performance in comparing the contractile properties of muscle fiber types, four performance characteristics are important: maximal force production, speed of contraction, maximal power output, and efficiency of contraction. Let's discuss these characteristics briefly. In general, larger muscles produce more force than smaller fibers because they contain more actin and myosin than small fibers. In general, this means more myosin cross bridges are available for binding to the actin and producing force. Also note that the muscle fiber maximal force reduction is often normalized to how much force the fiber generates per cross-sectional area of fiber. This property of skeletal muscle is called fiber-specific tension. Also note that muscle fiber maximal force reduction is often normalized to how much force the fiber generates per cross-section of area fiber. This property of skeletal muscle fiber is called the fiber-specific tension or specific force production. In other words, specific tension is the force production divided by the fiber size. Specific force equals force divided by fiber cross-section area. Muscle fiber force production varies across the muscle fiber types and will be discussed in the next segment. A key contractile property of muscle fibers is the speed of contraction. The contraction speed of muscle fibers is compared by measuring the maximal shortening velocity, called Vmax, of the individual fibers. Vmax represents the highest speed at which a fiber can shorten. Because muscle fiber is shortened by cross-section movement, called cross-bridge cycling, Vmax is determined by the rate of cross-bridge cycling. The key biochemical factor that regulates fiber Vmax is myosin ATPase activity. Therefore, fibers with high myosin ATPase activities, examples fast fibers, possess high Vmax, whereas fibers low myosin ATPase activities possess low Vmax, example slow fibers. A third important contractile property of muscle fiber is the maximal power output. The power of muscle fiber is determined by both the force generation and the shortening velocity. Specifically, the maximal power output of a muscle fiber is defined as the product of force generation multiplied by the shortening velocity. Power equals force times shortening velocity. Therefore, muscle fibers with a high force generating capacity and fast shortening velocity can produce a high power output. In contrast, muscle fibers that possess low shortening velocities and or low force generating capacity are not capable of producing extremely high power outputs. The fourth final important contractile property of skeletal muscle fiber is the efficiency of the fiber. The efficiency of the muscle fiber is the measure of the muscle fiber's economy. That is, the efficient fiber will require less energy to perform the certain amount of work. Compared to an efficient fiber. In practice, this measurement is made by dividing the amount of energy used, example ATP used, by the amount of force produced. In the next segment, we will discuss how the individual fiber types differ across the four key contractile properties. Functional characteristics of muscle fiber types. The three major fiber types exist in human skeletal muscle. Two subtypes of fast fibers identified as types 2X and 2A, and a slow fiber identified as type 1. Let's begin our discussion of muscle fiber types by examining the biochemical and contractile properties of both slow and fast fibers. Slow type fibers. Only one slow type fiber exists in humans. Type 1. Type 1 fibers, also called slow oxidative or slow twist fibers, contain large numbers of oxidative enzymes. Example, high mitochondrion volume and are surrounded by more capillaries than fast type 2 fibers. In addition, type 1 fibers contain higher concentration of myoglobin than fast fibers. The high concentration of myoglobin, the large number of capillaries, and the high mitochondrial enzyme activities provides type 1 fibers with a large capacity of aerobic metabolism with a high resistance to fatigue. In regard to contractile properties, shortening velocity and force generation, type 1 fibers possess a slower maximal shortening velocity, Vmax, and compared to fast fibers. This figure 812, comparison of maximal shortening velocities between fiber types. Maximal shortening velocity, muscle length, specific force, maximal power. Comparison of maximal specific force production, maximal power output between muscle fiber types. This mechanism to explain the fact was presented earlier. Example, type 1 fibers possess a lower myosin ATPase activity compared to fast fibers. Further, type 1 fibers produce a lower specific force than fast fibers. Figure 8.13a. The explanation of this observation is that type 1 fibers contain less actin and myosin per cross-sectional area than fast type 2 fibers do. This is important because the amount of force generated by a muscle fiber is directly related to the number of myosin myosin cross-bridges bound to actin. Example, the force generating state at any given time. Simply stated, the more crosses the generating force, the greater the force production. Therefore, the fast fibers exert more force than slow fibers. Finally, type 1 fibers are more efficient than fast fibers. This is important because at any given work rate, highly efficient muscle fibers will require less energy, example ATP, than the less efficient fibers. The difference in efficiency between the slow and fast fibers is likely due to the lower rate of ATP turnover in slow fibers. Fast type A and type X fibers, two subtypes of fast fibers exist in humans, type X and type A. Type X fibers, sometimes called fast twitch fibers or fast glycolytic fibers, have a relatively small number of mitochondria and have limited capacity for aerobic mechanisms and less resistance to fatigue than slow fibers. However, these fibers are rich in glycolytic enzymes, which then provides them with a large anaerobic capacity. The fastest skeletal muscle fiber in many small animals, example rats, is the type 2B fiber. For several years, it was believed that the fastest fiber in human skeletal muscle was also type 2B fiber. However, it is now established that the fastest muscle fiber in humans is type 2X fiber. The story behind this change in scientific thinking follows the state of 1980s German and Italian scientists independently discovered a new fast muscle fiber named type 2X in rodent skeletal muscle. Since the discovery of this type of 2X fiber in rodents, it has been determined that this type of myosin is similar in structure to that contained in the fastest muscle fiber in humans. Therefore, throughout the textbook, we will refer to type X fibers as the skeletal muscle fiber type in humans. The specific force per cross-sectional area of the fiber of type X refers to the similar fibers is similar to type 2A fibers, but is greater than type 1. Figures 8.13a. Further, myosin AT-phase activity in type 2X fibers is higher than the fiber types, resulting in highest Bmax of all fiber types. Shortening velocity. Figure 8.12. It follows that type 2X fibers generate the highest power output of all muscle fiber types. Type 2X fibers are less resistant than all other fiber types. This low efficiency is due to the high myosin AT-phase activity, which results in greater energy expenditure per unit of work. The second type of fast fiber is the type 2A fiber, also called intermediate fibers. Or fast oxidative glycolytic fibers. These fibers contain biochemical and fatigue characteristics that are somewhere between type 2X and type 1 fibers. Therefore, the conceptually type of type 2A fibers can be viewed as a mixture of both type 1 and type 2X fiber characteristics. The comparison of contractile properties between type 2A and X fibers are illustrated in figures 8.12 and 8.13. Further, it is important to appreciate the regular exercise training can modify both the biochemical and contractile properties of human muscle fibers and can result in the conversion of fast fibers into slow fibers. A detailed discussion of exercise-induced changes in skeletal muscle fibers will be discussed in Chapter 13. Finally, it is important to understand that while the classification of skeletal muscle fibers into three distinct groups is a convenient way to group the function of properties of muscle fibers, each classification exhibits a wide range of contractile and biochemical properties. Indeed, the biochemical and contractile properties of type 2X and type 2A and type 1 fibers are represent a continuum. Further, an individual muscle fiber can exhibit the blended quantities of more than one single fiber type. For example, some fibers contain more than one type of myosin isoforms. Example fibers can contain both types 1 and 2A myosin isoforms, whereas others may possess both types, type 2A and types 2X myosin isoforms. In summary, human skeletal muscle fibers types can be divided into three classes of fibers based on their two biochemical and contractile properties. The two categories of fast fibers exist, type 2X and type 2A. One type of slow fiber exists, type 1. The biochemical contractile properties characteristics of all muscle fibers types are summarized in Table 8.1. Although classifying skeletal muscle fibers into three general groups is a convenient system to study the properties of muscle fibers, human skeletal muscle fibers exhibit a wide range of contractile biochemical properties. That is, biochemical and contractile properties of types 2X, 2A, and 1 fibers represent a continuum instead of the three neat packages. Table 1. Table 8.1. Characteristics of human skeletal muscle fiber types. Characteristics. Number of mitochondria. Type 2X low. Type 2A high to moderate. Type 1 high. Resistance to fatigue high. Predominant energy system anaerobic combination aerobic. Phase activity highest high low. Vmax shortening highest high low. Efficiency low moderate high. Specific tension high high moderate. Fiber types and performance. Numerous studies have investigated muscle fiber type makeup of human skeletal muscles, and several interesting facts have emerged. First, there are no apparent sex differences in fiber distribution. Secondly, the average sedentary man or woman possesses approximately 50% slow fibers. Third, a highly successful power athletes, example sprinters, typically possess a large percent of fast fibers, whereas an endurance athlete generally has a high percentage of slow fibers. Table 8.1, A2 presents some examples of percentage of slow and fast fibers found in successful athletes and non-athletes. Typical muscle fiber composition in elite athletes. In elite athletes, sport, distance runners, type 1, more than type 2, track sprinters, non-athletes. Table. It is clear from Table A2 that considerable variation in percentage of various fiber types exists even among successful athletes competing in the same event or sport. Indeed, although the percentage of type 1 slow muscle fibers is highly correlated with the individual's VO2 max, the percentage of type 1 fibers can explain only 40% in variation in VO2 max. Between individuals. Furthermore, the two equally successful 10K meter runners have been shown to differ in percentage of slow fibers and that each possesses. For example, one runner might be found to possess 70% slow fibers, whereas similarly successful runners possess 85% slow fibers. The observational difference is that individual muscle fiber composition is not only a variable that determines success in athletic events. In fact, success in athletic performance is due to a complex interaction of physiological, biochemical, neurological, and cardiopulmonary and biochemical factors. Successful power athletes, example swimmers, generally repose a large percentage of fast muscle fibers, therefore a low percentage of slow type 1 fibers. In contrast, power athletes, endurance athletes, example marathon runners, typically possess a high percentage of slow muscle fibers and low percentage of fast fibers. Although muscle fiber types are known to play a role in sport performance, considerable variation exists among the successful athletes competing in the same sports. Muscle actions, the process of skeletal muscle force generation is referred to as muscle contraction. However, to describe both lengthening and shortening contractions of a muscle contraction can be confusing. Therefore, the term muscle action has been proposed to describe the process of muscle force development. This term is now commonly used to describe different types of muscular contractions. Example, both lengthening and shortening contractions. Several types of muscle contractions exist. For example, it is possible for a skeletal muscle to generate force without a large amount of muscle shortening. This can occur with individual attempts to perform a curl with a dumbbell weight that he or she cannot move. Figure 8.14. The isometric contraction occurs when a muscle exerts force but does not shorten. Concentric actions occur when a muscle contracts and shortens. What happens here is that muscle tension increases, but the dumbbell does not move, and therefore neither does the body part that applies the force. This kind of muscle force development is called isometric action and referred to as a static exercise. Therefore, the term muscle action has been proposed to describe the process of muscle force development. Isometric actions are common in the postural muscles of the body, which act to maintain static body position during standing or sitting. In contrast, isometric muscle actions, most types of actions of exercises or sports activities require muscle actions that result in the movement of body parts. Exercise that involves movement of body parts is called dynamic exercise, formerly called iso exercise. Two types of muscle actions can occur during dynamic exercise: concentric and eccentric. A muscle action that results in muscle shortening within the body part is called concentric action. An eccentric action occurs when the muscle is activated and the force is produced, but the muscle lengthens. Table 8.3 summarizes the specific classifications of exercise and muscle action types. Type of exercise: dynamic muscle action, concentric muscle length change decreases, static, eccentric, isometric. No increases, no change. No eccentric muscle actions can result in high stress within the sarcomere. This eccentric action induced stress on the muscle is often associated with muscle fiber injury, resulting in the loss of muscle force generating capacity and muscle soreness due to inflammation and swelling of the muscle fiber. More details about the exercise-induced muscle injury, and soreness are presented in Chapter 21. Speed of muscle action and relaxation. If muscle is given a single stimulus, such as a brief electrical shock applied to a nerve innervating it, the muscle responds by a simple twitch. The movement of the muscle can be recorded on a special recording device, and the time period for contraction and relaxation can be studied. A recording of the simple twitch. Note that the 3 time periods, latent period, contraction, and relaxation, following the stimulus. Stimulus, latent period, contraction, relaxation. Figure A15 illustrates the time of course of the simple twitch and in an isolated frog muscle. Note that the twitch can be divided into 3 phases. First, immediately after the stimulus, there is a brief latent period lasting a few milliseconds prior to the beginning of the muscle shortening. The second phase of the twitch is the contraction phase, which lasts approximately 40 milliseconds. Finally, the muscle returns to original length during the relaxation period, which lasts about 50 milliseconds and occurs, and thus the longest of the 3 phases. The timing of the phases is in a simple twitch varies among muscle fiber types. The variability in the speed of the contraction arises from differences in the responses of the individual fiber types that make up the muscles. Individual muscle fibers behave much like an individual neurons in that they exhibit all or none responses to stimulation. To contract, an individual muscle fiber must receive an appropriate amount of stimulation. However, fast fibers contract in a shorter time period when stimulated than do slow fibers. The explanation for this observation is as follows: the speed of shortening is greater in fast fibers than slow fibers because the sarcoplasmic reticulum in fast fibers releases calcium at a faster rate, and the fast fibers possess a higher ATPase activity compared to slow fiber types. The higher ATPase activity results in a more rapid splitting of ATP and a quicker release of energy required for contraction. Force regulation muscle. As stated earlier, the amount of force generated in a single muscle fiber is related to the number of myosin cross bridges making contact with actin. However, the amount of force exerted during muscular contraction in a group of muscles is complex and dependent on the 4 primary factors. The number and types of motor units recruited, then the initial length of the muscle, and the nature of the neuro stimulation of motor units, and the contractile history of the muscle. A discussion of each of these factors follows. First, variations in strength of contraction within the entire muscle depend on both the type and the number of muscle fibers that are stimulated to contract. Example, recruited. Recall from Chapter 7 that the motor units are recruited according to the size principle, and if only a few motor units are recruited, the force is small. It follows that if more motor units are stimulated, the force increases. Figure 816 illustrates this point. 816, increasing force of contraction, maximal response. The relationship between increasing stimulus strength and the force contraction. Weak stimuli do not activate many motor units and do not produce a great force. In contrast, increasing the stimulus strength recruits more motor units and thus produces more force. Note that the stimulus is increased and the force of contraction is also increased due to the recruitment of additional motor units. Also recall that fast fibers exert a greater specific force than do slow fibers. Therefore, the types of motor units recruited also influence production. A second factor that determines the force exerted by the muscle is the initial length of the muscle. At the time of the contraction, in regard is initial length of the muscle. At the time of the contraction, in regard to the force generation, the muscle's ability to generate force changes as a function of muscle length and optimal length exists for maximal force generation. The explanation for the existence of optimal length is related to the overlap between the actin and myosin. For instance, when resting, length is no longer optimal. The overlap between the actin and myosin is limited, and few cross bridges can attach. This concept is illustrated in Figure 8.17. Length tension relationships in skeletal muscle. Note that the optimal length for muscle exists which will produce a maximal force when stimulated. Lengths that are above or below the optimal length result in reduced amount of force when stimulated. Less than optimal length, fewer cross bridges interactions, reduce tension development. Greater length, no cross-bridge interactions, no tension development. Optimal length, maximal cross-bridge interaction equals maximal tension development. This concept is illustrated in the Figure 8.7. Note that when the muscle is stretched to a point where there is no overlap of actin and myosin, cross bridges cannot occur, cannot attach, and thus tension cannot be developed. At the other extreme, when the muscle is shortened to about 60% of the resting length, the Z lines are very close to the thick myosin filaments. Thus, only limited additional shortening can occur. The third factor that affects the amount of force of a muscle exerts upon the contraction is the nature of the neural stimulation. Simple muscle switches studied under experimental conditions reveal some interesting fundamental properties about how muscles function. However, normal body movements involve sustained contractions that are not simple twitches. The sustained muscle contractions are involved in normal body movements can be closely replicated in laboratory a series of stimulations and are applied to the muscle. The recording picture is Figure 8.18. 8.18. Recording showing the change of simple twitches to summation and finally tetanus peaks to the left represent simple twitches, while the increasing of the frequency of the stimulus, also known as x-axis, by the cluster lines, results in a summation of twitches and finally tetanus. Represent the recording of the picture in Figure 8.18 represents what occur when the successive stimuli are applied to the muscle. The first contractions represent simple twitches. Note that the frequency of the neural stimulus is increased, and the muscle does not have time to relax between stimuli, and the force produced is active. This is called summation addition of successive twitches. If the frequency of the stimuli is increased further, the individual contractions are blended in a single sustained contraction called tetanus. A tetanic contraction will continue until the stimuli are stopped or the muscle fatigues. Muscular contractions that occur during normal body movements are tetanic contractions. These sustained contractions result from a series of rapidly repeated neural impulses conducted by a motor neurons that innervate those motor units involved in the movement. It is important to appreciate that in the body, neural impulses to various motor units do not arrive at the same time as they do in laboratory induced tetanic contraction. Instead, various motor units are stimulated to contract at different times. Thus, some motor units are contracting while some are relaxing. This type of tetanic contraction results in smooth contraction and aids in sustaining a coordinated muscle contraction. And the final factor that influences muscle force production is the prior contractile activity of the muscle. Indeed, the recent contractile history of the muscle can impact muscle force generation in two important and different ways. First, if muscle performs bout fast fatiguing exercise, example for long or high intensity contractions, subsequent muscle force production is decreased. And the force that contributes to this fatigue induced decrement in muscle force generation were discussed earlier in the chapter. In contrast to negative effect of fatigue exercise, a short period of non-fatiguing contractions, example 5 minutes of low intensity exercise, has been shown to increase muscle force production. This type of low intensity muscle warm-up activity results in a phenomenon known as post-activation potentiation. PAP is defined as an increase in muscle force production that occurs following the bout of non-fatiguing submaximal muscle contractions. The mechanism is explained the positive impact of post-activation potentiation on the muscle performance that low intensity muscle contractions results in phosphorylation of myosin light chain. Example, proteins located at the base of the myosin cross bridge. This phosphorylation increases the muscle sensitivity. Biochemical process that involves the addition of phosphate to inorganic compound. Examples include the addition of phosphate to glucose to produce glucose monophosphate and addition of phosphate to form ATP. The addition of phosphate to an inorganic compound. Muscle sensitivity to calcium released from the sarcoplasmic tissue, and the end result is increased active myosin interaction and improved muscle force production. In theory, the proactivation potentiation induced by warm-up exercises can improve the athletic performance requiring explosive activities such as sprinting, jumping, throwing. Nonetheless, the investigations of PAP are inconsistent with some studies reporting performance improvement, whereas other investigations conclude that PAP does not improve human performance. Therefore, additional research is required to determine if PAP improves the athletic performance. For information on the PAP, please see et al. Finally, in addition to previous discussion of physiological factors that impact muscle force production, both aging and disease can negatively impact the muscle's ability to generate force. Indeed, aging 50 years of age plus result in the positive progressive loss of muscle mass, which reduces the muscle force production. Also, several chronic diseases, example cancer, muscle dystrophy, result in the muscle loss and therefore reduced muscle strength. See clinical applications 8.1 for more details. Clinical applications 8.1. Both disease and aging can negatively affect muscle function. Both old age and disease can have a negative influence and ability of skeletal muscle to exert force. Let's discuss the impact of old age and several widespread diseases on the muscle function. Age of muscle loss. Aging is associated with loss of muscle mass called sarcopenia. The age-related decline in muscle mass begins around age of 25 and occurs across the lifetime. However, the rate of the related muscle loss occurs in two distinct phases. The first is a slow phase of muscle loss, which is 10% of the muscle mass is lost from age 25 to 50. Therefore, thereafter, there is a rapid loss of muscle mass. In fact, from age 50 to 80 years, an additional 40% of mass is lost. Thus, Thus, by age 80, one-half of the total skeletal muscle mass can be lost. Also, aging results in loss of fast fibers, particularly type 2X, and an increase in slow fibers. From the clinical perspective, severe age-related sarcopenia have a negative health consequences because it increases the risk of falls in elderly. And induces the ability to perform activities of daily living, which results in loss of independence. Researchers are actively studying the mechanisms to explain age-related sarcopenia in hopes of discovering the therapeutic treatments. It is important to note that regular bouts of exercise remains one of the most useful and practical means to delay age-related muscle loss. For details of impact of aging on the skeletal muscle, see Mitchell. Diabetes, diabetes, diabetes. The incidence of type 2 diabetes is rapidly increasing worldwide. Unfortunately, uncontrolled diabetes is associated with progressive loss of muscle mass. Therefore, uncontrolled diabetes combined with the aging has potential to accelerate the age-related loss of skeletal muscle mass. Normally, both aerobic and resistance training has been shown to be protective against diabetes-induced muscle loss. Cancer up to up to up to 80 up to 50% of cancer patients suffer from rapid loss of skeletal muscle mass. This type of decrease related muscle loss is called cachexia. Also, cancer-mediated loss of skeletal muscle results in patient weakness and may account up to 20% of deaths in cancer patients. Indeed, cancer cancer causes wasting of breath muscles, example diaphragm, which can lead to respiratory failure and patient death. Because of the clinical significance of cachexia, investigators are developing methods to counteract the cancer-induced cachexia. Some of the most promising therapies include regular exercise combined with nutritional interventions. Muscular dystrophy. Dystrophy refers to the group of hereditary muscle diseases that weaken skeletal muscles. Collectively, these diseases are characterized by defects in muscle proteins that result in a progressive muscle weakness and the loss of muscle fibers. Although more than 100 different types exist, changing muscle dystrophy is the most common childhood form of disease. The prognosis for people with muscular dystrophy varies with the type. Some forms of muscular dystrophy can be mild and progress slowly over normal lifespan. In contrast, other forms of this disorder serve as severe muscle weakness along with loss of ability to walk and breathe without assistance. Although scientists continue to study the muscular dystrophy, there are current few clinical options to successfully treat the most severe forms of this disease. Force, velocity, power, velocity relationships. In most physical activities, muscular force is applied through a range of movement. For instance, an athlete performing the shot put applies against the shot over a specific range of movement prior to release. However, how far the shot travels is function of both the speed and the shot upon the release and the angle of the release. Because success in many athletic events is dependent on speed, it is important to understand the concepts underlying the relationship between muscular force and the speed movement. The relationship between movement and muscular force is shown in figure 8.9. Fast fibers, slow fibers, maximal force, velocity of movement. Figure 8.19, muscle force velocity relationships. Note that any given speed of movement, muscle groups with a high percentage of fast fibers exert more force than those with muscle groups that contain primarily slow fibers. Two important points emerge from the examination of Figure 819. At any absolute force exerted by the muscle, the velocity or speed of the movement is greater in muscles that contain a high percentage of fast fibers when compared to muscles that possess predominantly slow fibers. The maximum velocity of muscle shortening is the greatest at the lowest force. Example, resistance against the muscle. In short, the greatest speed of movement generated at lowest workloads. The principle holds true for both slow and fast fibers. What is a physiological examination for the force-velocity curve? The answer lies in the analysis of the cross-bridge connection between the actin and myosin. Recall that the amount of force generated by the muscle is determined by the number of cross-bridges attached between the actin and myosin. Also note that the cross-bridge connections between the actin and myosin require a certain amount of time to make this connection. Therefore, during rapid muscle shortening, example, high velocity movement, the actin myosin filament move past each other at a fast rate. This rapid shortening restricts the number of cross bridges that rapid shortening restricts the number of cross bridges that can make a connection and therefore limits muscle force production. Conversely, as muscle shortening velocity decreases more, therefore during rapid muscle shortening, the actin myosin filament move past each other at a fast rate. This rapid shortening restricts the number of cross bridges that can make a connection and therefore limits muscle force production. Conversely, a muscle shortening velocity decreases, more cross bridges have time to connect, and the muscle force production increases. The data contained in Figure 819 also demonstrates the fast fiber produce greater force and shorten at faster speeds than slow fibers. Figure 820, muscle power velocity relationships. In general, the power produced by muscle groups increases as the function of velocity of movement. At any given speed of movement, muscles that contain a large percentage of fast fibers produce more power than those muscles that contain primarily slow fibers. The data contained in Figure 819 also demonstrate that the fast fibers produce greater force and shorten at faster speeds than slow fibers. The biochemical mechanisms to explain this attribution is related to the fact that fast fibers also possess higher AT phase and activity than do slow fibers. Therefore, ATP is broken down more rapidly in fast fibers when compared to slow fibers. Further, calcium release from the sarcophagic mesoderm is faster following neutral stimulation in fast fibers than slow fibers. The relationship between force and movement speed has practical importance for physical therapists, athlete, and physical educator. This message is simply that athletes who possess a high percentage of fast fibers have an advantage in power type at like events. This explains why successful sprinters and weightlifters typically possess a relatively high percentage of fast fibers. As might be expected, the fiber type makeup of muscle influences the power velocity curve. See Figure 820. The peak of power can be determined by muscle is greater in muscle that contains a higher percentage of fast fibers than in the muscle that is largely composed of slow fibers. As with the force velocity curve, two important points emerge from the examination and the power velocity curve. At any given velocity movement, the peak power generated At any given velocity of movement, the peak power generated in a greater in muscle that contains a higher percentage of fast fibers than in muscle with a higher percentage of slow fibers. This difference is due to the aforementioned biochemical differences between the fast and slow fibers. Again, athletes who possess a higher percentage of fast fibers can generate more power than athletes with predominantly slow fibers. The peak power generated by any muscle increases with increasing velocities of movement up to movement speeds of 200 to 300 degrees per second. The reason for the plateau of output power output with increasing movement speed is that the muscular force decreases with increasing speed movement. See figure 819. Therefore, with any muscle group, there is ultimate speed of movement that will elicit the greatest power output. In summary, the amount of force generated during muscular contraction is dependent on the following factors. 1. Type of number of motor units recruited. 2. Initial muscle length. 3. The nature of the motor units, neural stimulation. 4. Power contractile activity of the muscle. The addition of muscle twitches is termed summation, when the frequency of neural stimulation to a motor unit is increased. Individual contractions are focused and sustained. Contraction called tetanus. The peak performance generated by muscle decreases at the speed of movement increases. However, in general, the amount of power generated by the muscle group increases as a function of movement velocity. Circulatory responses.